When news first broke that a well-known conservative activist had been killed, the headlines seemed almost too surreal to believe. The victim, a man who had built his career stirring political debates, drawing large crowds, and polarizing audiences across the country, was suddenly gone, struck down in a moment that felt less like a random act of violence and more like a scene from a dark political thriller. Within hours, law enforcement identified a suspect, a young man accused of carrying out the killing. The story exploded instantly across television networks, Twitter feeds, and late-night conversations. The victim's supporters mourned his death as a tragic blow to free speech and conservative values, while his critics, though often harsh on his rhetoric, were stunned into silence at the brutality of what had happened. To many, it wasn't just about one man. It was about the frightening escalation of political divisions in America. The accused, meanwhile, was painted in conflicting colors. Some described him as an angry loner, frustrated by the activists' rise to prominence. Others hinted at deeper motivations, an ideological battle, a desire for notoriety, or perhaps even manipulation by unseen forces. Neighbors, teachers, and old friends gave reporters a collage of anecdotes, portraying him as both a quiet, almost forgettable young man and someone who carried a streak of rage under the surface. As more details came out, the case revealed itself to be not only about a single crime, but about the environment that allowed such an act to take root. Political rallies had become more combative, social media more toxic, and the space for civil disagreement dangerously thin. In this volatile climate, the killing was more than just a tragedy. It was a symbol. Now, as the trial loomed on the horizon, questions began to pile up. Was this purely a personal act of violence, or the inevitable product of a society tearing itself apart? The answer would determine not only the fate of the accused, but the future of how America confronted its darkest political demons. The trial began under an atmosphere of extraordinary tension. Long before the first witness was called, lines wrapped around the courthouse as reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens waited for a seat inside. The prosecution framed the case as chillingly straightforward, a deliberate act of political violence. They described the accused as a man consumed by resentment, planning and executing the killing with cold precision. Prosecutors painted a picture of intent. They pointed to digital footprints, angry posts, late-night searches, even private messages that hinted at a fixation with the conservative activist. They argued that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to silence a political opponent. To underscore their case, they brought forward witnesses who testified about the accused's increasingly volatile behavior in the months leading up to the tragedy. The defense, however, told a very different story. Their strategy was not to deny the killing outright, but to complicate its meaning. They suggested that the accused had been caught in a storm of political extremism and mental instability, a vulnerable young man overwhelmed by forces larger than himself. They hinted at untreated psychological struggles, arguing that this crime was less about ideology and more about a mind pushed to the brink. The courtroom itself became a stage. Every gesture, every tear, every hesitation was amplified by cameras and broadcast to millions. Supporters of the victim packed the benches, often wearing shirts with his face emblazoned across the front. On the opposite side, sympathizers of the accused spoke about systemic failures, about how polarization, poverty, and unchecked online radicalization could twist someone beyond recognition. The judge, calm but visibly aware of the weight of the moment, reminded jurors daily that their task was not to settle political scores, but to decide guilt or innocence based on evidence. Still, it was impossible to ignore the larger implications. This trial wasn't just about one man's life. It had become a referendum on how divided America had become and how far its conflicts could spiral. As testimony continued, it became clear, no matter the verdict, the outcome would leave scars that stretched far beyond the courtroom walls. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional closing arguments, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The room was silent except for the sound of shuffling papers and held breath. When the foreperson stood and read the verdict, guilty, it was as if a thunderclap had rolled across the country. For the victim's supporters, the decision was a moment of justice, though hardly one of celebration. Tears flowed openly in the courtroom as his family embraced, finally receiving what they believed was accountability for a senseless act. Conservative circles declared the outcome a victory for law and order, proof that violence against political voices, no matter how polarizing, would not go unanswered. But beyond those walls, the verdict sparked another round of fierce debate. Some hailed it as the rightful end to a trial that symbolized the stakes of modern American politics. Others, however, insisted the jury's decision was driven by emotion and public pressure rather than facts. They pointed to the accused's mental health issues, arguing that justice had been reduced to a blunt instrument, punishment rather than understanding. On social media, hashtags related to the trial trended for days. Memes, video clips, and live-streamed reactions turned the legal proceeding into a digital spectacle. News outlets ran non-stop coverage, analyzing every angle: the politics, the psychology, the history of violence against public figures. Talk shows brought on pundits who framed the trial not only as a verdict on the accused, but on the nation itself. The accused, now officially convicted, showed little visible emotion as the decision was read. Some saw this as proof of his cold, calculated nature. Others read it differently: the blank stare of a man who had already accepted his fate long before the trial began. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. One side carried candles and portraits of the slain activist, chanting for justice. The other carried placards condemning political violence, while also pleading for a deeper look at the systems that had created a young man capable of such a crime. The verdict brought closure to one chapter, but it left the deeper wounds of division and mistrust painfully open. The conviction closed the courtroom chapter, but the story didn't end there. In many ways, it had only just begun. The killing of a conservative activist and the subsequent trial became more than a criminal case. It turned into a cultural landmark, a reminder of how fragile democracy can feel when political passions spill into violence. In the months that followed, commentators dissected the tragedy from every angle. For the victim's allies, his death became a rallying cry. Conservative organizations invoked his name at rallies, framing him as a martyr for free speech and traditional values. His speeches were replayed online, his unfinished projects elevated as symbolic of a silenced voice. Streets in some cities were named after him, and his portrait appeared on billboards alongside slogans calling for unity against political hatred. For critics, however, the narrative was more complex. They did not excuse the violence, but they argued that the activist's own confrontational style had fueled division in ways that made such tragedy more likely. To them, the case was less about one man and more about the cost of a society addicted to outrage. Meanwhile, the fate of the convicted killer became a new flashpoint. Supporters of the verdict demanded the harshest possible punishment, while advocacy groups pushed for clemency on the grounds of mental illness and radicalization. In online forums, debates raged not just about guilt, but about the deeper why. How could a young man, once ordinary, become so consumed by anger that he chose murder as his form of expression? Politically, the killing forced lawmakers into uncomfortable conversations. Hearings were held on extremism, online hate, and the limits of free speech. Bills were introduced to regulate social media platforms, citing the accused's digital trail as evidence of radicalization unchecked. Yet, predictably, the reforms stalled amid partisan fights, another reminder of the divisions the crime had laid bare. Years later, the case continues to serve as a mirror. For some, it is proof that political violence cannot be tolerated. For others, it is a cautionary tale about what happens when a society stops listening and starts shouting. Either way, the legacy of that fateful day remains etched into America's political story, a scar not easily healed.